You're watching 12 WKRC TV, a new generation of news. 12 Newsmakers starts now.
Dishonesty tears at the very fabric of our society, erodes the public confidence in our police department, and casts a shadow of suspicion upon our individual police officers. Dishonesty cannot and will not be tolerated in our organization. Any such conduct on the part of a member of the Cincinnati Police Department can and should be expected to result in my recommendation for dismissal from the employment.
Good morning and welcome to Newsmakers. Over 11 months after the shooting of Timothy Thomas on April the 7th, 2001, after a week of devastating riots, after a string of events that has undermined the fragile sense of community that exists between an already stagnant older central city and its suburbs, after hundreds of thousands of dollars paid to mediators, consultants, and experts, after thousands of hours of sincere efforts by individuals from every background and from every neighborhood of the region to talk about how to change things, after a boycott that has cost the city millions of dollars, after 11 months of devastating publicity that has convinced people around the world that we are a backwards racist place, finally, last Tuesday, the Cincinnati Chief of Police said out loud that Officer Stephen Roach violated two important standards of the department. While chasing Thomas through the back streets of Over the Rhine, he had his finger on the trigger of his gun, not on the guard, allowing himself to fire when startled by Thomas. Then the officer lied about it. And these violations of policy were enough to get him fired. But all of that was said clearly only now, 11 months later, 11 months late. I am joined this morning by Cincinnati Police Chief Tom Streicher. Tom, welcome back to Newsmakers.
Thanks, Dan. My pleasure to be here.
According to your report, this happens on the 7th. Interviews start. When did you, as an individual, know those two essential facts? At what point in this process were you aware that he had his finger on the trigger and allowed himself to get startled, and that he had told two different stories?
Well, initially the incident occurred on the 7th, and I was up in Chicago at a conference on racial profiling. I got a full briefing of what had occurred on the afternoon of the 8th as I was driving back, talking to Captain DeMasi on the phone. He told me...
And that's a Sunday.
That's a Sunday afternoon, and he had told me what had occurred and what had been said, and also about the utterance that Officer Roach had made, that the gun had just went off, or it just went off. We were a bit suspicious, as were the homicide detectives. I shouldn't say suspicious, but skeptical, and had decided to keep moving forward and digging into areas where evidence could potentially be found. On the 9th, the afternoon of the 9th, Captain DeMasi contacted me, told me that they had found the tape. The tape was not consistent with what Steve had told us back on the 7th. So on the night of the 10th, we interviewed Steve a second time.
On the night of the 10th.
10th, which is Tuesday night.
This is after the riots have broken out, because
Right.
the critical meeting at City Hall had taken place on the afternoon of Monday, the 9th.
Exactly.
Okay.
And on the night of the 10th, during that interview, when confronted with that evidence on the tape, Steve did change his story and did tell us what we believe is the truth about what actually did occur that night.
Let me just ask it straight. Why did it take so long? And I know you've answered this earlier in this week, but why did it take so long? Why did it take 11 and a half months for you to say this?
The complexity of the investigation itself. Number one, there are two investigations that begin the night of the incident. One is the criminal investigation. The other is an administrative investigation or review, commonly referred to as the internal investigation.
Which is what results in this,
Exactly.
ultimately. Okay.
Exactly. And what occurs is, when the criminal investigation is going along and the administrative review in the beginning, they run parallel to each other. They're independent investigations, and that's because of rules of law that don't allow them to intermingle. One has access to the other one has limited access to the former, if you know what I mean. Criminal investigation.
So the courts have limited access to the internal?
Exactly. Anything that, if I order you as a city employee to tell me something about what you're involved in or what you have knowledge of, you're compelled to forfeit your Fifth Amendment rights to self-incrimination. Because of that, then I cannot use any evidence, any of that against you or anything that I derive from it. So if I do that during this criminal investigation, if I cross over and order you to talk to me, and there's going to be a criminal prosecution down the road, I can't use anything that you've said. So all the statements that Steve would have made to us until the trial's over with, we couldn't ask him about, or we would not have been allowed to use it in the criminal proceeding.
Is there anything in this report that the court did not have, that the prosecutor, when he took Stephen Roach to trial, is there anything the prosecutor did not have access to that could have helped him prosecute that case?
No, absolutely nothing. We gave him everything.
At that trial, did people testify to the basic information, including those 2 points I just, that you said are the key points?
Right.
Did police officers testify to both of those?
Exactly. Yes, they did.
Okay. So you're saying that, and this, I have to say, the reason I'm saying this is that Deb Dixon, our reporter who covers the police
right.
and crime issues, and who I have a great deal of respect for, her reaction to me was, there's nothing new in this report.
Well, I wouldn't say that there's nothing new in the report. What I would say to you, and that's not the way to look at it, the way to look at it when you bring up what happened in court versus what happens in the administrative review is there are two sets of standards. You're following the criminal law and criminal proceedings when we do a criminal investigation. The level of conduct that you can engage in has a much lower threshold than our administrative requirements, our rules and regulations. So the law's standard for conduct can be here, while our rules and regulations standard for conduct is way up here.
So the fact
now the proof you have to chase for criminal law is way up here, and for our standards is way down here. Let me just put it to you this way: you own a private company. Mr. Pepper has P&G. He has rules in place there that you can violate as an employee, and he can fire you for them. It's not a law violation, and he doesn't have to prove that in court under a criminal proceeding. It's because you have rules on how you're going to run your company, and if you violate those rules, you just simply can't work here. And the city government operates the same way. The difference is there's an appeal process that employees can go through in city government.
But let's lay this first thing aside about holding his finger on the trigger.
Okay.
Let's just talk about the lying, because that was one of the charges in the trial, that he had lied about this.
Well, the charge is obstructing official business.
Well, and the content of that, the substance of that was he'd obstructed it by lying.
By giving two different stories.
Okay.
Is what it comes down to.
All right. Which is the same
when
thing
you
you're
start
saying.
When you talk about lying, our position is this: that Steve gave one story on April the 7th. He gave a different story on April the 10th. Both stories can't be true. Whether or not Steve lied is something Steve is the only person that can say whether or not he lied. I simply say, and our position is, both stories cannot be true. He's the one that has to offer the explanation for that.
But given that, how can evidence and all of that in courts versus administrative issues,
right.
Those seem to me almost exactly parallel. I mean, I don't want to get into the trigger thing,
right.
But on that obstructing of justice, if all of this evidence was there, then are we left to say, well, Ted Winkler just ignored that?
No, I don't think so, and that goes back exactly what I talked about before, and it's the burden of proof in a case, and the way it's been explained to me by the prosecutor and by some other legal experts is that, yes, he may not have told us, he told us two different stories, but did it really impede the police department from finding the truth? Because you did find the truth. And so he did not obstruct official business. It's one of those gray areas in the law that goes, you throw it up in the air and where does it lie? And I have to sit here and tell you, I don't have the legal expertise to explain it to you. I think back myself, perhaps maybe the proper charge would have been falsification. I don't know. If,
though, you basically knew that early in April.
Right.
Although you can't proceed with the internal investigation.
Well, you are going.
But you can't finish it. You can't make it public. You can't get up in council chambers and say what you said until you said, this past week.
Right.
And it makes a difference. The information may be out there, but it makes a difference when who it comes from.
Sure.
And when the chief stands up and finally says this, it makes a lot of difference. Why through that year, did it seem like you were playing it, balanced or maybe even supportive? And let me point to an example. When Stephen Roach, it was announced that Evendale was going to hire Stephen Roach. Then there was a huge uproar, and then it looked like, well, maybe Evendale wasn't going to follow through with it. As I remember it, you said, well, his resignation hasn't taken effect here. He can come back. That's only a couple of months ago. Why were you still saying things like that at that time?
Because it's the truth. His resignation was not effective, and until his resignation is effective, he was still an employee of the police department. And I can't at that point say, well, you're going to resign 2 weeks from now, so you can't come back. That's not within my ability.
So that is, and I didn't hear you say that. I only read it in the newspaper.
Right.
So you're saying that was just an administrative response, not a. In your mind, then, did you know ultimately he was going to get fired if he stayed?
No, because we hadn't completed the investigation. I had suspicion that there were some very grave consequences that were going to occur as a result of this investigation. But again, we have to have the ability to interview him, and after that, even after this is finished, Dan, you have to complete the administrative process. That is, there's a pre-disciplinary hearing. You still look at anything further that's brought in.
Is there anything, we've talked, you've been on in the past a number of times this year, and we've talked about what we've learned from all of this.
Right.
Is there anything that we have learned that could change this process, the timing of when you're able, as the police chief, to stand up and say, here's what we learned? Is there anything that can change in the future, given the experience of the past 11 and a half months?
I would say this to you. The most critical error the police department made was no statement being made on April the 7th, 8th, or the 9th until I returned to work. Something should have been said.
What should have been said?
A factual statement about what had occurred, that the investigation is being conducted, who's conducting the investigation, here's what we're looking at, all those different types of things. Anything that you can say without compromising the criminal investigation should have been said, so that if nothing else, people know the status of this investigation. People know exactly what occurred as best we can tell them at that point. And what happens when you don't do that is people start to get suspicious. People naturally should be suspicious of government, police in particular. We've got a tremendous amount of power and authority, so it's incumbent upon us to bring forward what we can without compromising investigations and give people factual statements. When I talk about factual statements, hard evidence that's not going to change. Whether I say it or not, this is not going to change. The danger in talking about statements that suspects or participants have made is those statements may change, as they did in this one. If the police would have come forward and said, oh, he said this, and then he said that, all of a sudden you're in a criminal proceeding and you're tampering with what the prosecutor has to do.
I understand the difference between the 7th, 9th, and 10th. That's
Right.
why I was trying to get that timeline clear. We're out of time, but one last thing on this communications issue. Have you changed policy inside the department about how you would communicate under similar future situations?
Actually, that policy and practice were already in place. And
They just weren't followed.
failed to be carried out. But again, let me emphasize this. Unique case. We've never come across something like this, a predicament like this before in my memory or in what I've ever been involved in, or the other assistant chiefs. I'm not finding fault with them. I'm just saying in hindsight, we could have probably done it better. But remember, these guys are all of a sudden holding this hot potato. And the danger is if they step out and say too much and the criminal prosecution or the criminal case falls apart, somebody points back to them and says, well, you blew it when you made that statement. And that's the delicate balance that they have to weigh.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Dan.
Okay, and we will be back.
Okay.
Stay tuned. After the break, an attempt to get some perspective on the mounting storm surrounding the revelations of child sexual abuse by Roman Catholic priests and the effort of the church to cover it up that has reached to greater Cincinnati.
Have some offenders been reinstated? Yes, a few have, but only after I have received assurances from the best expertise accessible to us that they in no way constitute a danger to children or adolescents. In view of the matters that have been in the media concerning sexual abuse of minors by Catholic priests, it seemed appropriate for me to offer some reassurance to the people of the Archdiocese of Cincinnati.
Archbishop Pilarczyk may have hoped that his press conference would reassure people, but in fact it caused a huge negative reaction, setting off police and reporters in all sorts of directions. This morning, I felt it might be useful to try to develop some larger framework within which to understand these issues. I am now joined by Stuart Bassman, a psychologist who has been in private practice for 26 years. A significant part of his practice focuses on treating both the individuals and families caught up in the incidents of pedophilia. Stuart, welcome to Newsmakers.
Good morning.
By the way, I want to get one point in. You run a program called AWARE. What is that?
AWARE is a program where we specialize in the treatment of individuals struggling with sexual abuse. We work with victims as well as perpetrators of sexual abuse. Our goal is to help people into recovery so that they can function in society.
So both ends of this need recovery.
Correct. In any given day, Dan, I'll see someone who's been a victim. I'll look in their eyes, I'll see their pain, the trauma they've experienced, and then an hour later I'll see someone who has offended another victim. And having that perspective really helps me.
What is pedophilia? I mean, that's the word that's just out there. Is that a technical term, and what is it?
Pedophilia is a psychological and medical term that describes an adult or even adolescent that has a sexual attraction to children. The word pedophile comes from the Greek. Pedo, P-E-D-O, means child. Phile means a lover of child. This is a mental disorder. It is an illness. And it is an illness to the extent that it disrupts someone's thinking, to the extent that they believe that children would be interested in them sexually.
And is there a profile of pedophiles? Can we say anything about what type of person, some characteristics that identify people who are pedophiles?
That's an excellent question. The answer is there is no profile, and that's what makes it most scary. The pedophile is someone who, to a great extent, appears to be quite normal. That is their greatest camouflage. They appear to be the person functioning in society, someone who could be in a respected position, someone who is in a position of authority, someone that you would trust. See, the typical thought about a pedophile is they look like a Jack the Ripper, someone that you would warn your children about. But the scary thing about pedophiles, they're uncles, they're aunts, they're ministers, they're teachers, they're soccer coaches, they're from people from all walks of life.
Now, you mentioned uncles and aunts. Can women be pedophiles?
Yes, they are. Yes.
Okay. So it's not, is it predominantly a male thing now?
At this point, it appears that it's predominantly male. It usually begins to manifest in around adolescence, that children start to becoming aware that their sexual preoccupation is with very young children.
I want to come back to that, but let me ask a couple of, is there some connection between pedophilia, pedophile? Does it make any difference whether a person is heterosexual or homosexual?
And that's an excellent question. Someone can be heterosexual and be interested in girls, young girls per se. We're talking about males right now. Or someone can be homosexual and be interested in young boys. They could overlap, but just because someone is homosexual does not mean at all that they're a pedophile.
Okay, so homosexuality isn't necessarily connected with, I mean, pedophiles aren't homosexuals. That is not
correct.
Okay.
And this is an excellent and it's a very important point for the community. Just because someone is homosexual or lesbian, it does not mean that they're a pedophile at all.
Okay, this is a whole different category that
Exactly.
we're talking about.
Exactly.
What about married, unmarried?
And this brings up another excellent point. Most people who have pedophilia, and it is an illness, it is a disorder of the mind. Basically, most people who have it are attracted to adults and children, but their primary sexual interest is on young children. So it can be the person who's married. So you could read in the paper about the person who's married, who has children, who molests their soccer team, or has an overnight and molests some of the children there, and everyone in the community can't believe it because he's an upstanding member of the society. Mm-hmm. But yes, someone who has sexual pedophilia can be attracted to both adults and children.
You say this first emerges normally around puberty, adolescence. Is it one of the things that is discussed, for example, in Roman Catholic circles, is doing better psychological screening before a candidate enters the seminary? Is that sort of screening really possible? Is it possible to identify people who have these tendencies?
That's another excellent question. The most significant aspect of pedophilia is the person's denial that they're causing any pain, that they're hurting anyone. There are national organizations where people belong to that promote sexual relations between adults and children, promote that. So in terms of identifying someone in profile, it's very hard because usually the person is going to be dishonest. They're either going to overtly deny, minimize, or discount their interest. So to ask someone if they're interested in children in a sexual way, most pedophiles, unless they're in recovery, will deny it.
What can be done for the pedophile, not the victim right now, but what can be done for the pedophile in terms of treatment? Is there such a thing as treatment?
Treatment basically looks upon dealing with an incurable mental disorder. And I want you to hear that, incurable. I saw the soundbite about the Archbishop talking about to reassure the community. I think one of the best ways to reassure the community is to let everyone know that a pedophile cannot be cured. What that means is that they will continue to have these urges, to have these attractions. What they can do is manage them by, in a sense, being able to be aware of certain high-risk situations, not be alone with children, not be in a situation where they can exploit the trust of other people. It can be treated. I have treated thousands upon people who have sexually offended.
Successfully?
Successfully, meaning that they're in recovering. Yes, they can be recovering sexual offenders, which means they acknowledge that they have pedophilia or other sexual disorders where they hurt and humiliate either themselves and or others. They can be treated. What recovery means, and it's to a great extent sort of like a recovering alcoholic, they acknowledge that they do have this illness, and as a result of this illness, they avoid certain situations. So for instance, the person who has pedophilia who is in recovery, they acknowledge that they have a sexual attraction to children, that they have a proclivity to exploit children, to take advantage of other people's trust. And as such, they will avoid every opportunity to be with a child, every opportunity. They will not be alone with a child.
I want you to listen, I want everybody to listen to two statements at different parts of the Archbishop's press conference last week and put them together that relate to this. Let's listen to this.
These priests have gone and gotten the treatment that they needed, and the treatment has been successful. These priests are no danger to anybody. We have received assurances from psychologists, from treatment centers. We are not here in a posture of tolerance of child abuse. If there were any question about their posing a danger to anybody, they wouldn't be where they are.
What would you say to that, those two statements?
I think there's one word to describe that: denial. Absolute denial. When someone has pedophilia, for the rest of their life they're contagious. Contagious to the extent that they could hurt, infect innocent children. I'm not saying that they have to be quarantined. I'm not saying that they should be excluded. I'm saying that people can lead lives with this illness with certain precautions. Are they at risk? Oh, most certainly. Are they still at danger? Definitely.
One argument that certain people in the church have used is that it's better not just to turn them out, but to keep them within the church and where they may have more supervision than just to turn them out into society and defrock them, in effect.
In the mind of a pedophile, there's a sense of getting over on people. There's a sense of basically taking advantage of trusted situations. So there's a sense that they, of course, need to be watched. Hopefully, they will watch themselves. Hopefully, they will develop a conscience, a sense of compassion.
And we're almost out of time. I'm very aware of that. But in this treatment, can you just send somebody away for 6 months or so and that's it? Or does a person have to continue, like with alcoholics, continuing to go to meetings, continuing to get treatment on an ongoing basis?
For the rest of their lives. For the rest of their lives, they have to be diligent in terms of making sure they do not hurt another child, do not take advantage of someone.
And does that mean being in contact with a counselor, or is it just something they do by themselves?
definitely there has to be a counselor, but somebody who's been trained specifically in this area.
Stuart, thank you very much. I found this very interesting, and maybe as this develops, we'll have you back.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Join us again next week to meet the men and the women shaping our community for the future. Have a good week.